Fabio Magrini, welcome. We are meeting again to discuss some deep topics.
Here again.
Today we want to talk about belief and facts and where they line up, how we come to one and the other, how science influences our faith and how beliefs lead us to better science when applied appropriately.
Yeah, it's do they believe? Do they actually belong in the same sphere? I think that's the first question, right?
Yeah.
Should belief and science be mixed up together in the same conversation?
And I always think, when I think about it in the biggest terms possible, if you ask me that question, I'd say absolutely. And I think about when Galileo had a difference with the Catholic Church, there was this huge kind of schism, but before then, science was always the informing agency within religion to keep religion on the cusp of the latest and greatest understanding of reality.
Right.
It's like, here are the new facts. Oh, great. Now, now we can preach this from the pulpit with more accuracy of what's currently going through the system of the zeitgeist or,
right.
whatnot.
Yeah.
But we pitted them against each other now for a while with the Scopes monkey trial. And since then it's been a lot of science versus religion, faith or belief versus fact and scientific method.
Right. And to me, there is also the counterpart, which is the religion of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
That basically we kind of encapsulate science in this kind of belief system, believing that all of the facts that we know at this moment are all that there are to know, and therefore it's absolute truth, not susceptible to change. So both of them have issues. And, we're not the first ones to talk about this. Galen actually was talking about this. Hume and Copernicus were talking about this, So we have very, very big shoes to fill, I guess. The scientific method was born to really reconcile this difference between, or this almost like conflict between belief and science. Right? Because there was like this religion of scientists, right? Or the atheism, of the French Revolution, which was a form of faith, the absolute rejection of anything that wasn't absolutely rational.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think of Descartes. We're getting really heady right here for the start, but I always think of Descartes. I always think of René Descartes. And his approach seemed to be separating the context from the thing he was focusing on and studying. And this becomes very problematic in application, because while you can get an accurate read on a small little thing, when you don't have it in context anymore, what have you got other than a strange, skewed abstraction,
Well, and I think that's where the rabbit hole goes, right? It goes from rationality into the realization of the brain that we don't have all the facts.
Right.
And what happens then, if you follow a completely rationalistic approach, you need to fill the gaps with likelihoods or half facts that explain in a rational way how things develop and fill the gaps between certain facts. And I think that's what we've seen a lot now in the conspiracy theories, right? Mm-hmm. Where there are kind of facts interspaced with wild conjectures or abstractions, forms of unquestionable and dogmatic belief, and all the mixture of irrationalities that have been repurposed into a rational fashion just because they are consequential to the previous thought. That famous connecting the dots when there is no connection, right?
Right. It's fun. It's really fun to connect the dots, and when you don't have to I mean, and doing a, you know, a 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, it's like a difficult level. It's laborious. It's kind of tedious going like, oh, does
Right.
that match color? Does the shape work? No, it doesn't. For,
Right.
you know, if you could just connect the dots, you get that
Mhm.
brain dopamine hit pretty quick. It's like, oh my
Right.
God, it's another
And
person who's connected to evil.
yes, and you know, and this is one of those puzzles which is a 1,000 piece puzzle, but we only have 850 pieces
Oh,
to play with.
we're never gonna have the complete set because
So,
there's so many pieces that just aren't available.
right, and again, this is not just conspiracy theories. It's even in science. It's even in
Right.
even in religion itself, right? There are some facts, and then which is kind of, you know, facts related to history, and then there are kind of abstractions, metaphors, you know, kind of and pure speculations
Right.
based on a certain belief system. So I think it's going to be interesting to discuss, you know, this process of filling the gaps and how that could be very productive, but also very dangerous when applied in a wrong way,
Right.
right?
So let me just suggest that we start with defining what we see as the purpose of science.
Right.
What would you say is the purpose of science? What are we trying to do when we break things down and look at them in isolation and really try to get a clear idea of what we're doing?
So I think that there's so many different descriptions, right, and definitions of science. We can get the dictionary description, but essentially, as I understand it, and as I look at it from a personal perspective, I see science as the study, as an epistemological process that applies to the study of the natural world. So it can apply to nature, it can apply to the human body, it can apply to animals, it can apply to stars and constellations, physics. So everything that surrounds us is um, is studied, and we can ascertain some facts. Is the study of what we can assert as laws, as principles that are valid and universally true of the world around us.
Right. Like gravity. I mean, for Newton to go, oh, that apple's dropping, that's the speed. It's a
Right.
consistent speed or a consistent acceleration, at least.
Right.
You know, like that's an incredibly useful
Mm-hmm.
fact when you can see it demonstrated over and over and over again. And you know, on Earth, at least, it does not, there's no real variation.
And it's only, and again, it's about the applications of those concepts, right? So gravity is not just important because it gives us a reason why we actually kind of stuck onto the planet, and if we jump we get back on, right? But it also gives us an understanding of cosmology, an understanding of the effect of tidal waves, of interactions between stellar bodies, or even structures within um, um, you know, a same geographical uh, you know, structure. So, you know, the lower you go into the sea, the stronger the pressure becomes because gravity compounds with the weight of water, and therefore, it gets heavier and heavier.
Right.
Or the higher you go, the less gravity there is, and therefore it takes longer for water to boil, right?
Right.
Because the molecules are less bound to the same force, and therefore they are become volatile with less heat.
And so this is wonderful because it's like many things for many years, for many centuries, millennia, human beings often would explain phenomenon with stories.
Right.
And sometimes the stories hinted at what science eventually came to, and sometimes they didn't. They were just sort of like explanations, like, oh, you know, because the phoenix, had this experience that the sun always rises and from that direction,
Right.
we had just explanations because our brains like explanations. We like things to fit. We like things to make sense.
We like to fill the gaps. We don't like to
Right.
not know. Our brain is, especially the left brain, is structured in such a way that it does not like not to have every piece of information of the algorithm blank.
And so it'll fill it in. If it's missing, it fills it in.
Right. Whereas the right brain actually enjoys the uncertainty, enjoys the fact that there are things that we don't know, and accepts the fact that not all the blanks need to be filled. So we are living in this conflict, internal conflict between our intuition that says, trust and just go along. You don't need to know it all. And the, rational mind that wants to have all the data, right, in order to make any decisions.
Right. And
Yeah,
so,
it's fascinating.
Yeah, right. And it's like, and so we fill in the gaps. We fill in the gaps of our knowledge with speculative ideas, and then we come up with this coherent storyline, and we believe in that, right? We believe in that reality until some event comes along to prove us otherwise. The beauty of science versus just story is that science can, if it's done properly, can be repeated, and you can actually learn, or expand how you do things. You can actually build a ship that can go into the deep ocean without you getting crushed and dying.
Right.
Build a spaceship that can go into outer space. So these are wonderful things that applying a lot of scrutiny to your beliefs, which is basically what science does in a nutshell, right? I mean, it tests the heck out of a storyline, out of a hypothesis, out of a theory.
Right.
And until you get down to the bedrock, if you will, it's like that seems like it's not moving. That seems like it's consistently a rock. We're going to call that a fact now, right?
And that what we seem not to understand, or we don't seem to accept anymore, is the fact that science is a moving target, right? So in the 40s and 50s, Einstein devised the laws of relativity. In the 60s, quantum mechanics starting to emerge, telling that yes, the law of relativities are partially true, but they can't explain everything. So there is another dimension that is more complicated, which is more flexible, that is less linear, that comes into play. And there are different rules that apply to this spectrum of situations, and so on and so forth. With medicine, again, we progressed every day. Up to 150 years ago, you would get leeches for most ailments, or you would get bled for most ailments, because there was this belief that it was the blood that was getting hot or too cool.
And even though that would be considered barbaric approach to medical science today in some instances,
right,
did it work?
Well, it worked for some, right? Because they kept doing it. So
right.
Based on their observations, there was some rationale to do it, because if it didn't work, then they would have stopped doing it.
Right.
Now, was that placebo? Was that a real effect? We don't know, because they didn't conduct clinical trials in the way we did. We invented we kind of devised the scientific method exactly to circumvent those circumstances where you base everything on your personal experience, your personal your personal understanding, and the understanding of people around you or your teachers. You actually go step out of yourself in a way, and you kind of become more objective. And by becoming more objective, you have a better chance to establishing the truth, as long as you prepare to have been wrong somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what is necessary for a scientific process. It's the ability to say, you know what, I went down this route, I tried my best, and this didn't work.
Right. And then you have a whole community of other people applying things the same way, who will look at your experiment from a different angle, question it from a different culture and perspective, and all of those diversities of opinion and viewpoint give more scrutiny to the issue, so that it's better tested.
Right. So the problem we have is that we don't question things enough, but we accept as given what we know at any given time. So, if Einstein himself, he died knowing that his own theory was going to be broken down and criticized. He realized, as he went studying, he realized that his own theory wasn't answering all the questions in the same way that he thought he did 20 years before.
Right.
So it's the ability to actually know that there is much that we don't know, and that what we don't know, we shouldn't speculate.
We should not speculate.
Right.
Or at least not speculate with too much faith, without a grain of salt.
Well, and that's the difference, right? In my opinion, is that you can have a belief, and you can fight for that belief, and you can, say that you have a belief, but you can't say that your belief is a fact until it's been proven inequivocably. And I don't know whether there is anything wrong about that in saying, I believe, on the basis of my experience, I believe that this is true. And then being wrong about it from a scientific perspective, 5 minutes later or 10 years later, there's no problem with that, because that's the role of science. It actually validates or negates a belief system and creates objective information around that.
And in part, it's using, again, a hive mind, many minds to correct for unique biases that we might have. So it's using a network to create a stronger system of scrutiny. But what is the oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and he relies on a cynical approach. He relies on the approach that you actually work a scientific method not to validate what you believe to be true, but to negate it. So if something is true, in spite of all my efforts to prove that it isn't, then it must be true.
Right.
Right.
Now, what's the purpose of faith or belief? Like, when is that important and valuable to us as a human species?
So from a psychological perspective, you know well that faith is actually the mechanism by which we fill the gaps, right? So the great unknown, what happens when we die, what we come to be, what is our purpose in life, right? So that's what faith answers, because there are no objective tools that can tell us, can give us an answer to that question, to any of those questions. Right? There is no way that we can have direct experience.
So if we're trying to use our predictive brains to plan for the afterlife,
right,
without a huge leap of faith, we're not going to have a plan.
And without a huge leap of faith, but again, it is also a survival mechanism. Because if you think about it in evolutionary biology terms, prey can only survive by having faith in the fact that they will survive, right? When the antelope runs away from the lion, The lion. I've been talking in Italian today, so I'm kind of my accent is getting worse. I don't know how to pronounce anything anymore. You know, if she hasn't had faith that the lion will not kill it, it will not even bother to run, right?
Right.
So there is a faith, and it's, you know, spirit of survival, conservation, self-preservation, that gives us that energy to move against the odds, almost, right? To function against the facts that are presented in front of us. So it has a utility, it has a use, this kind of attitude. But again, it should not be mixed with rational thought. We should be able to recognize that something is an act of faith and something is a rational, factual thought.
Right. And I think it's interesting here because if you separate the domains, if you say, okay, the domain of faith is for all of these things that we literally cannot explain right now with science.
Yes.
And then you say, well, and this other domain of where we really can, it's like there's lots of mechanics, there's lots of math that can be applied to this, and we actually have broken things down and we can explain how they work so well that we can repeat and invent stuff that will use these principles over and over again without fail.
Right.
So these are awesome. Both independently are fantastic tools for human beings. There's not one that's good and the other's bad. They're both really useful. But what I always think about is this sort of middle ground where they're beginning to overlap. And this brings us back to like Galileo and such. It's like, well, when science begins to grow, its tools get better, and it begins to reach over into an area that before was only faith could explain it because we didn't have the tools before to get there, then you begin to have a little tension or conflict between those who were pretty dedicated to these stories that were keeping them sane and the new science is saying, hey, that's not actually how it works. And if you want to know how it works, it will change not only your story, but a lot of other things too will change based on this new understanding.
Right. It works both ways. Yes, absolutely. But it works both ways. I always kind of think about the example of clinical psychology, right? So when Freud and Jung, and before then, the first clinical psychologists starting to rationalize and scientify, the functioning of the human mind, they were, frowned upon by most of the scientific community, because most of the scientific community was clearly rooted in the concept that psychology and physiology were not overlapping. There was no overlap between, the chemical functioning of the body and the abstract thinking of the mind. Right? And this was
so
like
crazy, though.
50 years ago.
Yeah, to think about that now, that it's just so crazy. The idea that there is no interconnectivity between the mind and the body is just mind-blowingly ridiculous.
However, that's also very pervasive in science, especially in physical science, in human sciences, where we still kind of have a huge difficulty, for instance, in disease, separating how the mind influences the body at a very real biological level, right? So we do have this kind of rigid, it's the rigidity of those systems, right? In the example of Galileo, that didn't have to be a drama, because the church did not have to be hung onto a concept, on a geocentric universe concept. Yeah. It shouldn't have made a difference to people of faith whether the sun went around the the Earth or the Earth went around the sun. It did not matter. It's because they built religion around an anthropocentric concept.
Right.
And the anthropocentric concept was only justifiable in their mind if the place where the humans live is the center of the universe and
Right.
everything revolves around us.
It was essentially the self-esteem or ego, self-grandiosity that was demanding from
Right.
the human brain that we are the center of the universe.
Right. So much so that, again, Christianity and Catholicism had become much more acceptable and famous and kind of popular from those times on. It's again, the fact that we're not the center of the middle of the universe, the center of everything, the fulcrum of existence, doesn't really change how people perceive faith. So it was an artificial, irrational hanging onto something that didn't really have a meaning.
But because it's really at a psychological level, it's a difference between specialness and maybe less specialness, right? It's
right. So
it has like a slight impact.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's like you can still shift the story and still be like, hey, we're still super special, regardless of where our placement is in the Milky Way or the universe.
Yeah, I mean, you can even see it from a very present perspective. That we're still talking about American exceptionalism, or Russian superiority, Aryan superiority, or white versus black, or Chinese versus Japanese. Kind of, it's all this
identity protective cognition run amok.
Right, and they have no meaning whatsoever, because I mean, America is as special as China, as it is Japan, as it is Luxembourg. Each country has their own identity. They have a past that they can be proud of, and they have a past they shouldn't be that proud of. It's what the human condition is. It's kind of achievements and mistakes.
And so rationality in all of this is interesting, right? Like where rationality screws up faith. Tell me, you've got an idea for how rationality ends up being a problem when it comes to faith.
Well, I can speak about my personal experience, right? Because I have a job and a career in a very scientific field, where I can only operate based on facts and proven evidence. And then I have my personal life, which is full of spiritual experiences and inexplicable ways of belief systems. To me, there is an interface between the two, and there are very big differences. So the interface is the intuitive process. The interface is when I have an intuition that there is something that I cannot prove, and therefore I seek within myself and feel what that is, right? And sometimes the result is a piece of science that I don't understand, and sometimes the result is you got to just have faith that this is how it is, right? And it feels right. At the same time, I don't go and design clinical trials based on a feeling, right? I can only suggest that that feeling is valid if I have a valid hypothesis based on facts on which that feeling can be validated.
But you can allow your intuition to influence your hypothesis, no?
Yes, of course, but I don't call it a fact. I need to be very conscious at every point in my day right, as I move through my day, or what is a product of my faith or belief system, and what is a product of my knowledge. And the two sometimes overlap and sometimes they don't. And when they don't overlap, it's fine. You know, I don't have to explain it. I don't have to rationalize my own faith. Because rationalize, at least in my mind, rationalizing it is going to be diminishing it, kind of limiting it.
How so? How do you experience rationality damaging your experience of faith?
Well, because I find that experience is completely intuitive, and it has really no facts. There might be some threads that connect facts, but they are not that strong and they're not that provable, right? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, I've been thinking for a while that there is a very strong connection between some form of ancestral trauma, right? That is common to every myth of creation and myth of human becoming, right? Human, that implies a separation from the divine. And it seems to me that separation occurred in the moment that we started behaving, in ways that has led us down a very hyper-rational road, where our cognition is only valid as long as we can make sense of everything. So,
and that's problematic because our minds can make sense of a lot of different things that don't even make sense, right?
Right. But that's why I'm talking. We have a computer, so our left brain is literally a computer with an algorithm, and that algorithm runs whether it has, numbers to churn on or not. And if it doesn't have numbers, it's gonna make them up until it's got something, and then it's gonna fill the gaps with, hypotheses. And if you look at them from a distance, yes, they all make sense. But then when you actually scratch, you see that the connections are not that valid, or they are kind of wild jumps in understanding.
Right. But how does this? So if you have something that is a piece of faith for you, like I believe I go to heaven after I die, and you try to apply rationality to that and try to, basically trying to prove that that's true, how might that screw up your faith?
Well, it actually kind of diminishes an action. So that's a really good question. Let me think for a second.
If you want a different example, I'm game for a different example.
I think that's really important. That's a really good example. So rationality is knowing, is understanding sometimes without knowing, right?
Yeah.
So we understand the process. We might not know the reasons for that process or everything about that process. Faith is actually knowing without understanding. So it's that process of being certain of something without having to have proof of that. The problem to me is that in our philosophies, we want to mix the two. We want to reconcile the two. We can't leave them alone to be what they are, which are separate systems of both useful, but not completely interconnected. And again, from a physiological perspective, those two systems are represented by our two brain hemispheres, the left brain and the right brain. They are connected but they don't completely overlap. So if you have somebody, you remove the left brain from them, they will make up some of the functions of rationality and cognitive thought, but it's never going to be as complete and as thorough as when they had the other hemisphere. Likewise, when you take off the right brain, people will not be able to have abstract thought, intuition, and the ability to extrapolate from one thing to the next. They become very literal, right? So it is very physiological. It's not made up. And because we are dominated by our left brain, we wanted to explain everything, so to take over everything. And
Right.
we keep negating the value of the right brain, which is the one that doesn't need to understand what it knows. There are things that we know to be true. We don't have proof that they are true, but they're still true, right? And then we might be wrong. You know, it's like, again, the antelope that takes a turn to the left instead of the right, and it finds, you know, 3 more lions instead of the open ground.
You know, risking opening a can of worms here, I'm tempted to talk about my faith, my root tradition of Christian Science, which in the very title, it tells you we're trying to fuse rationality and faith or intuition. Like, we're trying to put these things together. And in a very real way, that's what it is an attempt to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I, at a certain age, you know, I grew up in it, but at a certain age, I fell in love with the metaphysics of it, because the metaphysics seemed so logical. It seemed to explain a lot. But I think mostly, it was the intuitive process that I was going, wow, that's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The way we're describing the way we're describing reality is so beautiful. There's something that must be true about that.
Right.
So that was my intuition, basically going, you know, it wasn't a rational process. And the Christian Science process really goes with a bunch of assumptions. It starts with rudimentary assumptions that God is good, that God is all powerful, and then extrapolates logically that if you take these assumptions to be true, then there cannot be evil in the world.
Right.
Which is a very intense claim that most people would have issue with, like, comprehending that concept. But that's the whole real framework of the Christian Science metaphysics. And historically speaking, I think that Mary Baker Eddy, the founder, she was a gifted healer in her own right before she knew what she was doing, before she had any understanding of what she was doing.
Mm-hmm.
She was already doing spiritual healing work, you know, just hands-on touch, boom, healed. And so she was looking for, when she had some major healings herself and some revelations of how to do it, when the understanding started to come to her, she needed to explain it and teach it to other people. So she then began bringing the rational approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of people, that the rational approach is really good for them. I think for others, it's not. I think it's hard to teach Christian Science to people because you have these two approaches. And some people say, you need to have more faith, you know, and other people say, you just need to think more. And honestly, I don't know. I think the answer is different for everybody.
I don't know. I think that again, the general principles seem to be always valid, right? Every religion and faith you look at, there are basic principles that are universally true, right? That creation was an act of will. It wasn't an act of coincidence, right? There was a consciousness behind the act of creation. Then you can call it God, you can call it Maya, you can call it what you want, but essentially there was a willful process behind the act. And then there is everything around, you know, that mechanism. Then there is the physical science of spirituality, right? So there is this belief that, again, is spread across all faiths and religions across the globe, that through faith or through the application of faith-based methodology, you can heal. So in almost every religion, even in the Aboriginal world, there is this application of spiritual healing by touch, by music, by singing, by vibration of some sort, and so on and so forth. So maybe that's science that we haven't discovered yet. So that's science that our ancestors who didn't have all of our overlays in terms of expectations, validation, and having to be popular and convince others and spread the word. They just had to be accepted and cultivated without questioning it. So there was that knowing without understanding. Whereas for us, it's really difficult to conceive because we can't fit it into an established process.
Right.
But that's why I was making the example of clinical psychology or neuropsychology or neuroimmunology, because now we see that, for instance, there is a physiological effect that comes from certain practices. We know that a trauma is going to increase your inflammatory state, the production of inflammatory cytokines and the activation of inflammatory genes. Whereas meditation, physical activity, mindfulness will actually decrease those factors. So we are at a point in our science, in our scientific process, where there is we are starting to fill the gaps to a certain extent.
Right.
But instead of looking at it as a unique holistic system, we see one system as a replacement for the other.
Right.
Right.
And that's, again, the identity protective cognition, I think, going online, going, oh my God, my whole paradigm is being threatened by this terrible thing called science.
Right. Because, again, from a personal perspective, I've been most successful at my job when I actually let my intuition guide me. And, for instance, looking at patterns from patients or from patient data and let them speak to me without me kind of having a hypothesis or a preset, expectation of what would happen. And that's when actually I kind of got the most insightful and groundbreaking understandings in my career that kind of led to understanding molecules and drugs in a different way.
Yeah.
So,
let me go on a limb here and extrapolate how I see rationality potentially screwing up faith.
Then we can talk also about how faith screws up rationality.
Oh, well, that's a bigger topic. But let me get to this one, because it's like, when you have faith, it's you're partially you're just calming your system down by going, I believe in this, I believe this is real, and I'm certain about it. And then you're not having to question. There's no extra thought going on. There's no nervousness. It's a relaxing state for you to just meditate on what you think you know. But what's interesting about any faith is that it's really different for every individual in it. And so when you apply rationality to the faith, your left brain wants to start storying and comparing and analyzing. And so you begin to break down the faith into a classical story structure that your mind already has. And that may, one, destroy the awe, the awe of the experience, which, as Joseph Campbell says, is an essential aspect to religion. An essential function of religion is to give you a relationship to the unknown, to the mystery. If you try to de-mystery something through rationality, you're robbing yourself of that spiritual experience, that experience of oneness with everything.
Right.
Because you're trying to break it down. Then you also notice that the people you thought were exactly in lockstep with you, because you share the same faith, they don't think the same thing as you do at all. They're on a slightly different storyline, or they're the main character in their story at the very least, and
or a
you're the main
completely
character in
different
yours.
storyline. Yes.
Or and so then you start to feel conflicts, and then doubt comes back in because of the conflicts that were really unnecessary in the first place. Because when you're talking about the mystery, so few of these things are explainable in any case. And so what's the point of trying to rationalize it?
Yeah. Well, don't you think that's one of the reasons? So one of the reasons for that is because we don't stop at faith, but we actually go into the details, right? So it's actually when again, if you talk to a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian, like in the joke and a Joe, and you bring them in a bar and you start talking about, God as, the guiding principle of faith, they're all gonna agree, right? It's when you start talking about what you eat, what does God want you to eat, that you start fighting. What your paradise or heaven looks like is that you start fighting, right?
There are Buddhist koans, which are essentially little riddles that get you out of rational thought, that are like impossible questions essentially to answer.
Right.
And they're designed to bring you back into the present moment.
Exactly.
And I feel like a lot of religion is doing that very thing. A lot of religion, and in Christianity, you have a lot of stories that are designed in a way, or the psychological function of these stories is to model yourself after a superhuman mentality, like to be, as pure and as high integrity and as clear as you can possibly be, as selfless as you can be. These aren't, when you make them literal and you sort of apply all this rationality to them, they start to lose their psychological effect.
And also we end up kind of mixing up what are philosophical or theological principles with historical realities, right?
Right.
So when we apply the Bible to the letter, when the Bible was written 4,500, 6,000 years ago, when the average, life was, 30, 35, men married, at 20, and girls kind of married as soon as they become fertile, right? We would talk, in today's world, that is an unthinkable environment. That women would be owned by their husbands, that slaves would be, celebrated by religion as a rightful way to be and set up society. It's not, that is not religion, that is not faith, that is the historical concept into a faith or a belief-based system manifested itself. Right. But the belief-based system is not faith, it's what we build around faith, right? Again, it's the gazelle that when it runs and it kind of turns right once and finds the lions, and therefore it needs to rush in the other direction, next time it's going to try and run left, to start with. And the lions will have to adapt because they only follow that one pattern, right? To kind of catch the prey.
Right.
So it's the rationalization of something that shouldn't be rational. And I think that Buddhism does that very well. Or, asceticism, ascetic Christianity also does that very well. The suspension of judgment, right? The suspension of action, the suspension of anything that can interfere with a purely intuitive and faith-based process.
And that just seems so psychologically healthy, because we get into a rut of being run by this rational predictive brain, where it's constantly trying to literalize every story, fill in the gaps on everything else. And we need breaks. We need breaks from that, where we have a change of a viewpoint, and we actually go, I wonder if that's even necessary,
Well, you and I move in this kind of new age, spiritual community. I kind of use a lot of, air quotes here. And to me, one of the more extraordinary findings in this, as I came into this very, very late in life, and coming from a highly rational mindset, and throwing myself into this kind of acceptance of faith, guided by my own spiritual experiences and kind of, and mystical experiences that, kind of experiencing, Native American, ceremonies, or different kind of indigenous ceremonies that kind of bring you into a state of consciousness that you didn't know you could achieve, right? And everything around this system tells us we shouldn't have any expectations, we should live for the moment. It's general principles that apply to Christian Science as much as Judaism, as much as Christianity, right? Living in the moment is basically have faith that things are going to turn out okay, right? You don't need to plan it too much. And yet, everybody I know works on an expectation basis, works on a situation where, we plan to get endorsement of approval for our actions on the basis of what we say, what we believe, how we dress, and how we express ourselves. So even in that most liberal and spontaneous process that kind of is a mixed match, of traditions and belief systems, you still have the intrusion of the rational mind that starts measuring, oh, I'm more spiritual than you. I'm kind of less, that is less spiritual, oh my gosh, that is so judgmental, right? And that is a judgment in itself, because I'm judging you being judgmental, right? So it's like, if you think about it, it's a pitfall that is always there, regardless of what we do and regardless of how we do it. My cat obviously doesn't agree with that.
So I guess I want to, how do we then, what's a more reasonable approach for us to go forward with this? How do we bring intuition, faith, and science together in a way that's more harmonious, that it allows for these gradual input of new science to influence and inform our faith, and also gives intuition its due in the sciences?
Well, if I had the answer, I would be a very famous man, right? And we would be kind of living on a different level.
What do you believe?
I believe, that there is a middle. I believe in a middle way. I believe in separating, in being honest. I believe that being honest means to know when you're actually talking about facts, established facts, and when you're talking about beliefs. And to be very honest, that beliefs are not facts, and facts are not beliefs. And to communicate with others accordingly, and not to expect that my beliefs need to be shared for me to be part of a community. Because I can connect with you or with anyone else on the basis of facts that we share. But I can believe in something completely different. You know, I can believe, you know, I can be a Catholic and still be a friend to a Wicca practitioner or a witch or a, you know, or a Satanist even, as long as we agree that, you know, certain things are wrong and certain things are right. Right.
And I can be a Christian Scientist and still honor medical science today, which I have found a lot of people troubled with that,
well,
with that middle path.
You're only troubled because we are applying the same mechanism that the church applied when Galileo came up with the idea that, you know, Earth was rotating around the sun. The fact that if you believe that, you know, Western science or medicine might have a role in helping healing, you destroy the principle on which your faith is based.
Right.
Whereas they, you know, they coexist in a hypothetical way. Let's say that we believe in medicine and Christian Science, right? We need if we believe in both, we actually need medicine, because we are not evolved or good enough to have that amount of faith that allows us to completely surrender ourselves to the healing of God.
Right.
And therefore,
many of us, many Christian Scientists, struggle with their own methodology because it's tricky. It seems tricky, at least. It seems difficult to completely surrender, let go, have enough faith, whatever it is. It's not working consistently for everybody who's trying that spiritual healing method.
Because to completely let go and surrender to the method, you need to be completely surrendered to your right brain.
Right.
And unfortunately, we evolved as a species on our reliance on the left brain. So there needs to be some practical, you know, counterpart. There needs to be something that you do in order to receive an outcome.
We refer to this as the Michael angel, or the Michael method, left brain, and the Gabriel method, the right brain. You know, the Gabriel method is the one that actually heals. The Michael is like the defender with the sword.
Right.
But it ultimately, the healing always comes through the Gabriel method of the knowing, the letting go, the truth coming to you.
Right. So by we, you mean you, Christian Scientists?
I mean Christian Science. Yeah. That's the. But I think other Christians can relate to those concepts. You know, the Michaelangel carries a sword, Gabriel carries a book.
So Christianity, I think, is a perfect example of a faith that descended into rationality, and therefore, in a way, kind of digged itself into a hole where you're either Christian or you aren't. Right? And that anyone that is not a Christian is actually an enemy of Christianity. And that should never be the case. You know, again, if you look at the life of Christ, he was never somebody to actually say, I don't like you, right? Or you're not one of me.
Right. And I'm always, as a Christian Scientist student, I'm always curious what medical science is doing, particularly in the realm of placebo effect and other things, but in every other place too, because to me, it's a constant unfolding. There's constant discovery about healing itself.
Right.
I would never claim that Christian Science had the monopoly on healing. I think it's got a very unique viewpoint, which is interesting, and I think needs to be shown more light in medical science, which I admit is very difficult to do. But that said, I think medical science may be the future of many approaches to spiritual healing, because it's going to keep uncovering. The more everyone's putting scrutiny and intuitive hypotheses upon these issues, the more we're going to figure out potentially about the mechanisms of healing.
Well, it's the idea that the spiritual and the physical are two different things, right? Again, it's the contrast between psychology and psychiatry, or between psychology and neurology, right? Where one is a physical science, the other one is hocus pocus. So it's the science that we don't know yet, right? So the way I conceptualize this, particularly on the healing, from the healing aspect, is that there are energies at play in nature, right, that we are not completely aware of, or at least we cannot categorize in
measure them physically,
or measure them physically in a rational way. That doesn't mean they are not measurable. That means that our tools to measuring them are not there. Like, up to 250 years ago, we didn't have microscopes, and therefore we couldn't see bacteria and microbes or cells. And therefore, we still thought that there were some smaller elements that couldn't be perceived. But we couldn't prove it. Then now we can look into microns, right? But we know, again, physics and physiology tells us that there are elements that are smaller than what we see and perceive. And now we have all this research in, quantum physics and particle physics of, small molecules or small particles, smaller than the atom, smaller than any subcomponent of the atom, that we only understand are there, not because we can see them, but because of the effect that they exercise on the environment. So what if healing, was similar to that? So it is not a separate field from the, at least for me, it's not a separate field from the physical. It's a physical that we do not have the tools to measure yet. But it doesn't have to be separate from the spiritual, because we are beings of, of flesh, right? We are made of molecules, we are made of cytokines and pheromones and enzymes, and they exercise a lot of functions that we still don't understand. We take most of the medicines we take, we actually don't understand completely how they work. We just know that they work, right? So
yeah,
it's the separation to me that doesn't quite compute. It's the fact that it's one or the other, rather than it could be both. As long as we are clear that up to one point is belief, and from one point on is science, or is established facts.
right.
And we shouldn't mix them up.
And there is a proving ground where science is beginning to step on the toes of, or inform. It depends on how you view it. Stepping on the toes or informing a previous belief to get either which may verify it, may disprove it, may influence how that faith continues to evolve.
Right. So, example, if you think about it, we've been thinking for hundreds of years there might be other planets where humans live, right? We've been imagining that there are other species out there. And we never knew, and we still don't know whether it's true or not. But what we didn't know before that we know now is that there are planets in our galaxy and in the universe in which the conditions for life as we have on Earth are also present. So the possibility of life outside of Earth is actually much more likely today and much more scientific today than it was 60 years ago, right? So that doesn't mean that it's true, but it means that little by little, our understanding is kind of catching up with our intuition, right? We cannot be alone in the universe, right?
Right.
Now we know that
That's faith, but it's becoming an educated guess.
it's becoming an educated guess, but it's not yet an established fact.
Right.
So we still cannot say, just because there are planets that might look like Earth, that there are other species like our species somewhere. And what we can't assume is that any extraterrestrial lives are moved by the same principles and cultural patterns as we are, right? Because that's, again, an anthropometric approach to life, right? When we actually kind of relate emotions and conditions that belong to us onto an external medium.
Well, this is great. This is great, Fabio. Any wrap up thoughts on all of this? I think this has been awesome.
I think that, again, the problem for me today is not so much around faith wanted to inform science. It's actually the opposite. Is wanted to be scientific and factual, even around things that we don't have certainty upon. And I think a lot of the divisions that we see in society today are due to the constant effort to fill the gaps rationally where gaps cannot be filled.
And it justifies the domination of the left brain over the right brain, which makes us inherently imbalanced as human beings.
Right. And it makes us actually very, very conflictual, right? Because then it becomes the hyper-rationalism of saying, okay, these are, this is all the sequence of facts, right? When you actually have 2 facts and 55 hypotheses in that reasoning. Yeah. Makes you faulty and makes you dogmatic about your knowledge. And that is when things get badly wrong. Yeah. Because you shouldn't be attached to the details, right?
So little language tweaks would basically get through a lot of this. To say, I believe, or my hypothesis is, or my suspicion is, versus I know that, or it's true that, or this is the case, or everyone knows, blah blah blah. The only times you're going to say something is factually true is when it actually is a fact that's been confirmed by a large group of scientists.
Right. And realize that even the fact could be contradicted by new data.
Right.
So it's the realization that none of the fundamentals on which we rely are actually unmovable. But what we have is fundamentals. So for now, I know that the body works in that way. If I give somebody aspirin, they're going to have less inflammation, they might have less pain, and their blood is not going to coagulate as much. I don't know how, 50 years ago, I didn't know that giving aspirin to somebody would be able to prevent cardiovascular events. But now we know that that's the case, right? I didn't know 50 years ago that, I didn't know 10 minutes ago that there could be a rationale for the use of heparin in COVID-19 cases. But, knowing what we know today about this disease, that seems to make a lot of sense, right?
Right.
but it's not a fact, right? We don't have the experiments and the validation to say, okay, we know this now, we can put it aside and forget about it, right?
Right. Right. Well, awesome, Fabio. I think this has been great. This is where we need to be talking about right now is these issues, how to really understand the difference between what we believe and what we know.
Right, because there is a lot that we believe that we know, and we are operating on a lot of belief and not a lot of knowing right now.
Yeah.
So I find that this is, yeah, I agree. I think this is the conversation. I would like to have more on this.
We will.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Fabio.